to be 200 miles away. But as you're going to find when you do a statewide plan, there are going to be ripples. The population is going to ripple, and not everybody's going to get what they want. At the same time, you're dealing with districts that start around 500,000 people and go up to nearly 1 million. So a lot of the communities are going to be decided simply by the size. And the issues you're going to face are going to be along the edges. I've also looked over the years and been involved with the Voting Rights Act issues. I think they're very important in this state. Once again, that can be done in a logical manner. I think I encourage you to read, if you haven't already, the report of the masters, the special masters to the Supreme Court in 1991. And they will tell you that they looked at the Voting Rights Act districts first. They started in central L.A., and the plan that they came up with led to the largest number of non-Anglo legislators ever being elected here. So again, following the logic of the state, you can do it well. I just have kind of some thoughts about what sort of people you should be looking for, since that's your job now to find the right kind of consultants. First of all, you should look at somebody that's done this kind of work before. I don't think anybody's available that's done it statewide before, because the legislature did it, and I don't think you want to hire any of their folks in 2001. The masters did it in 91, and I did it in 81, and you don't want to hire me. But you need people that sort of understand how the state breaks down into regions. And I think it's going to be a lot easier if you look at the state and begin to kind of break it up. And I'll give you just a thought there. I'm working with some folks on just looking at different ways of doing the state. Now, one way to do, if you go down the coast, and if you respect the mountain range, which the masters did, that separates the coast from the inland, at the Oregon border, come down, go through all the counties that touch San Francisco Bay, then go down and take in Santa Cruz and Monterey. That's a fairly sensible region. And there's corridors of transportation, media markets, and if you do that, if you look at it, you'll find that that's just about 12 congressional districts. So if you say, hey, we're going to take that region and try to divide it up in a sensible way, then you only have to go outside the region one time to get the necessary population. And I think that you'll find that it's going to be much easier if your consultant approaches it that way. I also think your contractor needs to know what is wrong with the current plan. And I should tell you here that I was engaged by 3 cities in 2003 as their expert witness in a lawsuit against the current plan on state constitutional grounds. I also thought it was unconstitutional on Federal Voting Rights Act grounds, but I didn't get into that suit. Stockton was one of the places that hired me. It turns out that San Joaquin County, that has 500,000 people or thereabouts, has no assembly member that lives in the county, no state senator that lives in the county, and no member of Congress. Every one of them lives outside this county of 500,000 people. That's strictly a result of how they were divided up. And they're mad about that. And I will tell you that I'm going to be working with some people in Stockton next month, and we're going to come to you and say, look, this is what happened to us, and we're mad as hell about it, and we don't want it to happen again. I think your consultant needs to know that. I think your consultant needs to be aware of what was done. And there are certain pressure points. You're going to hear a lot about Voting Rights Act violations in the San Fernando Valley, and I'm absolutely convinced that happened. The Asian community of Berryessa and Milpitas was divided up purposely for partisan reasons. They should be brought back together. Oxnard is in the wrong place, again, for partisan reasons. So, your consultant needs to understand that. I know you're going to have a lot of public hearings. I would hope that your consultant is there with the computer, with the maps. And so when the public comes and says, this is what we would like, your consultant can say, well, that can be done if the districts are drawn such and such. Or your consultant may have to say, look, given the criteria, given the equality of the districts, what you're asking for may not be possible. But I think your consultant really needs to know the state, know the entire state. And finally, you have, I think, received messages about the need for political balance, and I'm one of the people that has used my small ability to get that message out. So, as somebody that's been in this before, you do not want the politicians or representatives thereof to have any role in drawing the districts. At the same time, you really need to have people that everyone can feel confident about. And I'll just give you one quick example. From my having looked at the state, you are going to have to collapse Democratic districts in the San Francisco Bay Area. You have no choice because the population simply does not allow as many as are there now. You're going to have to, I think, collapse some Republican districts in the Inland Empire. They are highly gerrymandered right now. You will find when we get the census data that the Latino growth into the Inland Empire, Riverside and San Bernardino has been very great. And I think Section 2 will require you to address that. You're going to make Republicans mad. You're going to end up making Democrats mad. You're much better off, I think, to have them within the tent, rather than looking around to do referenda, which they can do under the law, or lawsuits. Arizona had 10 years worth of lawsuits, and that was a commission that really tried, and they did as good a job as they could. And the final Arizona plan has shown, as we know, has shown a lot of switches between the parties, which California hasn't had. And I would just say, kind of my final thought is from the Godfather, and that is the sound advice: keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. So that's kind of what I wanted to share with you, and I'm very happy to have had the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other comments from the public? Okay, seeing none, let's move to the agenda items. The first one being recruiting and hiring.
Sorry, Mr. Rob, just for a clarification, because what I'd asked the chair to put a couple items on the agenda, and just to note that they may have to come up, just given whatever time we have today, to, in front of the full commission. But if you look on, these aren't numbered, but if you look at the full commission business meeting, I guess it's page 1, 2, 3, 4 of the published agenda, there are a number of items that I'd raised with the chair, and they're not. I think they're not specifically calendared for this meeting, but I'm hoping to bring them up at some point, either here or in the full commission. So the three items that I had put in front of the chair were some discussion of the publicly available redistricting software. That's one. The second was looking at various data where we're going outside of the census data, which would include neighborhood information, communities of interest, and then also Voting Rights Act related data, which includes racially polarized voting studies. And then the third area, which I think is also, is listed on the advisory committee agenda, is some consideration of, or to introduce some discussion, and I think we're going to have some follow-up as well on looking at potential adjustments to the census data. So I put those on the agenda. Again, I think we've got a number of other items for the technical committee this morning, but just to flag those as issues that I had brought up with the chair.
Commissioner Anchetta, when you say adjustments to the census data, what kind of adjustments were you thinking about?
Well, that's a good question. Without getting too much into the content of the discussion, there are areas and there's precedent both in California and in other states to take the PL94 data and either reduce or reallocate some of those numbers depending on what you're trying to do. And there are various groups, again, this comes in different states and different localities, that may include, for example, overseas individuals, including military personnel, students, prisoners, for example. And those are...
It would not be related to actually adjusting the number based on undercount or anything like that?
It could be based on undercount. It could also be on how the allocations fit within particular counties. For example, areas that have large prison populations, whether one might adjust some of those numbers based on the prison population. But I think some of this is going to be presented in a training session tomorrow or Friday, perhaps. And again, I think there's some issues that require a little more in-depth analysis. But I wanted to sort of start the discussion at some point.
Having some experience with adjusting the census count, I can tell you that's a very complex subject.
Right.
But I mean, see, I don't mind. I mean, I don't see any problem in making judgments about what's included in the allocation. But if somebody's going to try to change the count based on expected undercount, that's a much more complicated issue, which we would never resolve in time for.
Right. No, and I think and that's been certainly been an issue in past census counts and in redistricting, but that's not specifically what I'm looking at at this point.
Let me. Could I ask a question about the prison population?
Yes.
Now, do you know whether they're typically counted within their geographic area, or whether prisoners are counted in their county of origin?
Right. So the question, and this is the core question actually regarding prisoners at least, is that the census has, and for this most recent census, has counted prisoners where they are physically located on April 1st, 2010. So that population, if they're in the prison, is counted in the prison and as part of that particular census block or tract, or whatever unit you want to look at. They're not counted at their home residence or last known residence. What has happened in a couple of states, and again, this is an issue we might want to take up, I'm simply introducing it as one of a couple issues around the census data, is that it is possible to subtract out prison populations, which a number of California counties actually already do for their county boards of supervisors. It is also possible to, although this requires additional data which is outside of the census, which is actually going to the basic state agencies that run the prisons and perhaps the federal prisons as well, is you can try to get data on last known residents and try to reallocate those numbers to the last known residents. Now that's a complicated set of data that you have to try to get, and I don't know if that's readily available in California. So that's an issue that would have to be looked at. But that's the core of a lot of these questions, at least around the prison population.
Yeah, because there's, of course, the early release program, now no longer the early release program where, prisoners have gone back to their county of origin, community of origin. And, I don't know whether we have those numbers down.
To my understanding, only 3 states have, there's an HR bill currently in motion to actually have, I guess, nationwide, that consideration with census counts. Currently, there's the state of New York, Maryland, and Delaware, and I believe the District of Columbia also, because they have Lorton Prison, which is just across the Potomac in the state of Virginia. So that count typically is contributed to Washington. But my question to Commissioner Chetta, with non-census data, I heard you in a previous meeting mention sociological or demographic or other perhaps, I guess, academic studies or research that might complement what census data we have to sort of give us a better idea of what communities of interest are, what the demographic composition is of areas. Is that a comment?
Could I suggest something really fast, Commissioner Parvenu, and for the rest of my commissioners, that I think this is a fantastic discussion and one that we as a technical committee needs to take up. I think that maybe the place for it, if we have an opportunity, might be later today. I'd like to suggest that maybe, I'm thinking thinking in terms of how we can best utilize our time. And I think there's two pressing issues that we really need to address that we need to bring to the full commission, and then there might afford us an opportunity to discuss some other things as we move forward. And let me throw this out there and see if my fellow commissioners agree. I think the first one would be the recruiting and hiring consultants and the IFB process and what we're going to be moving forward, and we have a presentation for that because we need to decide as a technical advisory committee if this is how we want to proceed in terms of also the dates, the data, the things that will be given to the full commission for consideration. And then the other one is we also need to discuss some of the issues of software as it relates to the outreach and what we're required to do by the by the proposition, and we need to make some decisions about the money and who and modes to be able to do that outreach. I think that would be important information that we need to make some decisions on today, and we can bring to the full commission. And then I would suggest afterwards that maybe some of the issues that Commissioner Anchetta had brought up that we put on the agenda to or have an opportunity to discuss if time is willing. Is there anything else that commissioners feel it might be important for us to address now in terms of decision making and that we can bring to the full commission?
That's
I think everybody would concur to that with that suggestion. Okay. So with that in mind, let me ask Carol Umfleet to. Excuse me, Dan, did you want to make a comment?
Got microphones everywhere. Only that I'd like to introduce our specialist, Carol. I think that the public needs to know that Carol has well over 25 years worth of experience with the Department of General Services as a contract specialist. And as soon as we were running into our problems with delegated authority, we looked for someone who could help us move through the regular process, and Carol has done a fantastic job in very few days. So I will turn it over to Carol.
Good morning. Within the last week, we did compile and complete our statement of work, which is really an outline of all the requirements that we need.
Sorry, real fast. Carol, do you think you might be able to give just a little bit of background? I'm not sure if people in the audience kind of are aware where we are today and what we're discussing, how we've gotten to this point. Would that be possible to do a brief? Or maybe, I'm not sure.
To hire a consultant to do the line drawing, we have to issue a competitive bid. So what we're doing is putting together the requirements for that bid, and then what I will proceed to talk about is exactly where we're at now and where we're going to go in the next month, because our target for award is by the end of March. So we developed our statement of work. We gave that to the Department of General Services Procurement Division yesterday. General Services Procurement will be administering this bid for us. That's a good thing for us. They are the experts. They'll facilitate it. It'll be as fast as it can be done. And any exceptions they can make to the established processes, those are the people that will know what can or can't be done. I asked them for the release date for the bid and the award date, and they have not compiled that yet. But they understand we have 1 month and that this needs to be awarded by the end of March, and they have committed that they will do everything possible to get that done. Before the bid can be released, they are going to have to put that bid package together. They'll take our requirements, they'll add all the codes, the laws, the certs, and the bid package. It's unknown at this time whether it's going to be a request for proposal, which is a more lengthy process, or an invitation for bid. The document we have is suited for a request for proposal, but because it's a longer process, they are looking at releasing this as an invitation for bid just because of the time constraints. But we don't know yet. What procurement will do is put this bid package together. They have to get Department of General Services legal review and approval. They're required to post online and advertise. It will be a minimum of 3 days. So this will not be released before next week.
Is a request for bid, are the elements of that similar to what we have before us with the RFP?
Yes. It's a little more streamlined, though. Mm-hmm. In case anyone wants to know, the guidelines that are going to apply to this whole process, it's out on the Department of General Services Office of Legal Services. It's called State Contracting Manual 1. Everything. So if anything I say, you've got further questions and you want to go see what an interagency agreement, everything they say about that, it's there. If you want to see all of that, it's out there. So just as a reference, that's a good place to go look. And it's where I'm studying, memorizing that manual. Because of the short time frame, we have some challenges with getting this contract awarded by the end of March. A typical bid of this sort would take 2 to 6 months, and we have 1 month to do it. A couple of the challenges in particular, and where we're going to have decision points. One is if we have to change a requirement in this bid, whether we determine ourselves that something needs to be included that hasn't been, or whether we get a request from the contractor, we will have to issue an addendum. That addendum will delay the bid at least 5 days. By the time we process it, we mail it, they digest it. It has to be also reviewed by DGS Legal. So that's a 5-day delay. And whether we're going to have enough time to still make an award by the end of March depends on, for instance, if we get a request for change from a contractor and they challenge us and we have to meet with them and we have to discuss this, just depending on what kind of time that's going to take, we're going to have to make a decision about whether we want to go ahead and cancel this bid and go with alternative processes, which I'll talk about at the end. We have the right to cancel this bid at any time. We do not have to make an award. The other hard spot is going to be if we get a protest from the contractor based on they should have received the award, or it could be they recognize we haven't followed our own bid procedures, or we've not complied with some state code. It could be we don't agree with how you've scored these bids and the points you've awarded. Any of those things could cause a protest. The problem with that protest is by the time we get it, we're going to be within a week of April. So there just is no time because it's at the very end of the bid right before we make the award. The good news is Department of General Services has the authority to process and review that protest. It doesn't have to go to any other department or division. They will make a determination of merit. But even, it's a given if they find there's merit, that we will not be able to award because we will go into some scenario with 5 and 10 day increments with information passed back and forth, and ultimately a hearing officer will hear it. So certainly if there's a determination that the protest has merit, we will not be able to award this bid before April. If it's determined that there is no merit, what I'm not sure of and what I will need to talk to our legal about is whether they have a finding and it's final. We notify this protester there's no merit. If that's the condition, we may be able to make an award still. I don't know if the legal department is going to be required to further engage with that protester and go back and forth with information. So it's my opinion if we get a protest, we're probably going to have to cancel the bid. If we have to issue an addendum, maybe. The other place where we've got concern, it's not likely that all of the leaders in the industry are going to submit bids with material deviations that are going to result in their bid being rejected. But it could happen. If they come in and they say, I don't agree to this contract term and condition, or if they come in and say, with a conditional acceptance of this requirement that we have, their bid is rejected. We have no options. And so that's a consideration. Now, if we are not able to award based on this bid, we have a couple of options. One of those options is an interagency agreement with another state agency or university. That will also require review and approval by DGS Legal. But it is simply sitting down and negotiating the terms and conditions and issuing an award. Now, understand at this point, we've got a week, maybe, if we're lucky, and depends on whether we did an addendum and used up, everything but 2 days. And we will be looking at this in front. I mean, we will be prepared to move with these documents in advance of this last minute. So just understand, we'll be prepared to move, but we still have a processing timeline we're going to have to adhere to. We could run into a problem with an interagency agreement if we end up with an entity that does not agree to the terms and conditions, and they want to sit and talk about it for days and days, or just refuse to agree. We will not be able to issue a contract. Another alternative, and these are the only two I can think of or that I know of, is a non-competitive bid contract. And that generally has, media attention. That's not something anybody wants. And so that's a consideration before going there. Generally the only reason you get to issue or get an approval for a non-competitive bid contract is if there's only one contractor or it's an emergency. Health and welfare and all of that. But there are cases made for a business case. They have been made and they have been approved. The approval authority is going to be, if you don't have an agency secretary or department director, it will be the top 2 executives in the commission that will be required to sign that NCB, or non-competitive bid contract. That's the approval. That will also have to be, we'll work directly with DGS Legal to get that done. We'll be working with them elbow to elbow at that stage if we go with an NCB. So that's where we stand. We have, I think, it's going to be a real challenge to get the bid awarded. It can be done, and as long as Procurement Division continues to tell us they're doing everything they can, and that's what they've been doing. They've been a lot of assurance. Get it to us, we'll do what we can. So we'd like to award, but just understand those are the variables we're going to be dealing with and the options if we're not able to.
I think it might be helpful, too, a little bit. I had an opportunity to talk with Dan as the liaison from the Technical Advisory Committee to kind of look at this again, to review where we stood after last meeting when we had looked at the option for a technical consultant. It was wishes of the Commission to put it out to bid, and since then we've seen what's the process that will involve in terms of an RFP or an IFB. And I think just the timeline that's going on, as Ms. Umfleet had mentioned, I think the intention was hopefully to get this request for proposal or whatever form it is out by next week. But again, there's certain dates that have to be met and a certain amount of review, and I think it sounds like we might even be further behind than I thought. It was to be released next week, but it sounds like we won't even get approval until next week regarding...
they could call me, but the point is we can't release the bid until they advertise it for 3 days.
In 3 days, okay.
And it's Wednesday.
Yeah, and I believe there were some issues in terms of... as Ms. Umfleet mentioned, if protests happen along the way, we can always stop the bid. The only alternatives are the interagency agreement or the non-competitive bid, which leaves us back to square one, which is where we were last meeting. The advantage, I think, to going out to bid, at least initially, if we can work with DGS, would be to be able to have the opportunity for outside groups that are interested to be able to submit their proposals. We can see what the proposals are. If for some reason along the way there was a protest or there's something that shut down the process completely and we were not able to make our deadlines. Oh, sorry.
The fact that we will have completed this bid, even though we didn't award it, we've gone out, we've surveyed the market, we've collected all of their skill sets, we know what their prices are, is going to support a good business case.
And the point being that if that were the case, if we had all this information from those potential consultants, if for some reason the process was brought to a screeching halt and we decided to go either the interagency route vis-a-vis maybe some of the applicants, or if we ended up having without another option is to do a no-bid contract, we would have a selection from which to choose. And I think, as I understand it, talking to Mr. Claypole, the state would look more favorably on a no-bid contract if we had done that initial research and had laid out plans from multiple organizations.
Now, it's my understanding, I think Mr. Claypole can speak to this directly, but it seems to me that some of these processes can go in parallel, right? So, for example, if we can pursue, we'll go through the competitive bid process as we're doing right now, but we can also, in parallel, say, look at an interagency, or at least explore interagency agreements at the same time.
The documents.
Okay.
The process time is going, it's going to occur right at the end of March.
Okay.
And there's nothing we can do about that. But we will be able to develop the documents and be in place to move quickly.
Yes, and that was always our intention, was that as soon as we had the meeting in Claremont, we realized that the time frame was too short for us to simply rely on the process to work perfectly. So we are developing, as Carol said, the documents to put them in place, but we can't, I don't know that we can necessarily in good faith pursue a separate agreement until we know that the avenue we're taking isn't going to work. Having said that, though, with much of this, the important part is having everything set in place in case something goes wrong.
Yeah.
Are we going to discuss the bid itself?
Only if you'd like to.
Yeah. The question I have, and maybe Commissioner Anchetta could jump in around page 3.
I gave away my last copy. But you can...
Okay, well, it says that the redistricting database will not contain precinct-level voting data and elections data. What was the reason for that?
We have a different section.
We need roll.
Page 3. I'm sorry. What was the...
If it's in this section 6.
Is the 7 here? Or is it this?
No, page 3. No. Item number...
It's page 8 on this document.
Oh, okay.
So with Commissioner Baraba, with that question, I believe that came as us pulling together several different examples of how these contracts have been let statewide for different municipalities and so forth. And so it gave us we saw that statement in several different ones, and we said this is probably something that needs to be in this technical this technical portion. We also discussed it with one individual who had great knowledge of the process, and that individual didn't exclude it from the technical portion. However, you have an equal amount of knowledge in this area. If there's a reason why that shouldn't be in there or it needs to be modified, if we do it now, it'll still move forward in the revised form.
The reason I raise it, and I'd be interested in Commissioner Anchetta's point, is if we start looking inside of a district and we have, say, an ethnic group that really dominates it, but there's differences within the group, it might be that we could see where those differences were geographically on, say, an initiative vote or a particular controversial issue or whatever it might be. And I just would think that we would want to have access to be able to do that if it was if it would be available to us. And if it's excluded in the database, then obviously we couldn't do it unless I'm reading this correctly.
I'm sorry, could you give me the section and subsection numbers just rather than the page numbers?
Section 6, I think.
6. Subsection 8?
Section 6, redistricting database.
Section 6, yes.
Yeah.
Section 6, subsection 6.
Subsection 6, okay.
Yeah.
6.
Sorry.
At the last line.
Okay, here we go. Precinct level voting data, elections data. Well, I mean, most of the data that we're going to be getting, and that will be in the statewide database and available to whoever does the work for us. There'll be some elections data in that database, is my understanding. But, and again, this is primarily for Voting Rights Act purposes, and this goes to that item I tried to get, was getting on the agenda for later today or tomorrow, is that for Voting Rights Act compliance, we're not looking at the whole state. We're looking at various areas where there may be majority-minority populations or the Section 5 counties that you're going to get, or we're going to want to get, if it's available, certain kinds of data that looked at the minority populations there, the absence or existence of polarized voting, those kinds of things. That's the kind of data we're either going to have to get through public testimony or our research or perhaps published studies, if there are some published studies out there. But they're not going to be in the census data. And we'll have to figure out what we can get in the best form at the time we're going to start drawing lines, because, as I think I mentioned in previous meetings, that data often is not produced unless there's litigation. So it's a challenge for us as a commission to figure out, well, are we going to draw a minority district here because we think it's likely to cause a Voting Rights Act violation? We'll have to deal with the best data we've got at that point. But technically speaking, that's not in the redistricting database data that you get from the Census Bureau. It may be incorporated into whatever data the technical consultant is working in with actually drawing the lines, but it's not going to be in the statewide database formally. But we might have, again, we might have that information. It can be coded. It can be looked at by the software that the consultant is using. So I think all that can come in. Whether that's germane to the contract language is a question. I'm not sure if you could delete it, you could leave it in. It may not. I think it's important that the consultant know and that we know that some of that analysis has to go into the draft and the final map drawing. And whether it comes in, again, through the statewide database or some additional data. But in the final analysis, we'll still have to look at what we've got at a certain date and say, okay, this is the data all the data we've got we can use. Let's start drawing some lines.
It is very important. If you wish to have, if you think that you have the need for that data, then we need to pull that out or revise it, because we're going to bind our contractor with this contract, and that would and that will be one of the things that binds them.
I guess what my concern was when I read it, it precludes the opportunity if it became necessary to look at that, and I didn't know what the value was of leaving it out. That was, I guess, the question I had.
So would you suggest eliminating that line, or?
Well, I would suggest that, but I want to make sure that we're not doing something dumb by doing that.
Well, I mean, if you look at the sentence before that, it does talk about a separate contractor. So I think one thing we might try to settle at this point is, are we going to get a separate contractor who will look at that data? And again, it doesn't have to be all in a single database. At some point you have to say, well, here's some other data we've got. Let's adjust the lines. But the question, I think a bigger question is, are we going to have a separate contractor in addition to this contractor that will do that? Because if we are, then they can work with that other kind of data, and this contractor can focus on the core stuff.
I think part of the issue, I think there's a couple issues here. I think one is the VRA expert or experts will also be very heavily involved with the technical consultants. I also think there's an opportunity, and this is probably a point of discussion for us in terms of, it's my understanding that in terms of the actual line drawing services, as opposed to the VRA specialist, maybe where we can have more than one with some different opinions, with the actual line drawing services, it's best to have just one consultant do that. But that doesn't preclude us looking at maybe an additional technical consultant who could serve as a peer reviewer, someone who could be a checks and balance for the individual or the organization that's doing the line drawing, that could tell us whether or not, I mean, both for checks and balances for the individual contractors, but also to give us, as a commission, an opportunity to hear other points of view. I think that's a point of discussion. I'm not sure if we want to do that now or wait for a little while, but.
Well, we got to make a decision now because we want to slow this process down.
Well, I think in terms of maybe Mr. Claypool could elaborate on how that would work. I don't know if it necessarily needs to be written in. Does it need to be written into the?
I believe we've already written in the requirement that we have the option to provide a peer review consultant on this, and it was one of the thoughts that came about trying to provide some balance for those individuals who were worried that if we had a line drawer that was perceived in one manner or another, that we would also have someone that could go ahead and provide this type of oversight, particularly in an area where it's perceived that someone could skew the data in a way that would cause the commission to possibly make a map in error, or make an error in drawing a map, I should say. So we've included that as language that we have the right to put in a peer review person in that or entity, and we would have a separate contract and have considered within the budget that we're building a separate contract for that function. We would do it by the same competitive bid process. It isn't as critical as our line drawer because we need this individual to come aboard and start working with us on the plans for the input meetings. We would need the peer review member to come aboard as we start getting completed maps.
And is that, I'm sorry, is that actually in the contract, or is that something,
I believe if you go to the first page.
It'll be under administrative requirements, and that will be on, I'm not sure if your document is identical to mine, but
I think I had it on the first page.
was it under a section that we could edit or not? I didn't even look at the not.
So the first reference to it, to a peer review, it will be in Section 1, Introduction and Overview Requirements, and it will be the paragraph directly above the key action dates. And for the benefit of because we haven't distributed this, it says the contractor must also provide unfettered access to any completed map and or report and the supporting documentation for either of those documents during any phase of the redistricting process to a separate peer review individuals or entity assigned by the Commission for the purpose of providing an independent evaluation of the map and or report prior to its submission to the Commission for its consideration and or approval. I have to say there was some confusion. I talked with the director, the executive director for Arizona in 2000, and he had, in a conversation, said that they had a peer review go over their maps and to provide consenting or dissenting opinions. Having talked, however, with Karen McDonald and as she spoke with Bruce Kane, who was involved in that, he didn't remember a peer review process there. So I'm not exactly sure how the peer review actually occurred in Arizona, other than I'm certain that the executive director was certain that he had hired somebody and paid somebody for that function. It makes sense, however, I think, in our process, and he believed that it made a great deal of sense in their process to provide this counterbalance and just that second opinion before you get it that everything had been considered.
This is written. This is an option for the Commission to exercise should it choose to do so. It's not a requirement.
It is. For this document, it's written as an option, but it also shows that it will be a separate entity. And then we were going to propose at this meeting that we start forward with an RFP for that function.
And just to clarify, too, Commissioner Geary pointed out in Section 5, Number 6, which is on page 4, there's also a Commissioner peer review, which is in the non-editing sections for those of us who breeze through that area. So it is, I think it would be helpful for the full Commission to also see that.
So I guess I'm still questioning why we would eliminate the possibility of getting access to that information.
Well, and as you were talking, I began to realize where this came from because of what we're looking at here. I believe it's that particular set of data for the person that we spoke with, and that was Paul McCaskill. And when we started asking for an opinion regarding what was in this, we needed to find someone that had experience. And his opinion at that time was that I believe he thought that it dealt with polarized data. Is that and so his opinion was that and I hope I characterize this correctly, that those neighborhoods would be clearly defined, and it wouldn't be necessary to look at this data set to establish that, and that you would only come back to this data set if it were necessary at a later date and have somebody else do that work for you. Now, I can come back, I can have Raul give me the exact words that he said, and that might be helpful. So if you'll give me a few minutes, I'll just step outside and get that language, and then I can bring it back to you.
We can put that on the ban, so before we,
Okay.
I don't want to slow the process down, but I don't see, I mean, it could be informative information. It doesn't have to be polarizing information.
Okay.
And why we would exclude information that would give us further insight into an area is the question I have.
Commissioner Baraba, do you have a suggestion as to maybe how you would prefer to have the language written if we wanted to give
I'd eliminate the
staff?
sentence.
Right. Well, because I'm not sure, it seems like this subsection 6 is largely informational for a potential contractor. It seems like it's like that. And again, whether I don't think it necessarily binds us to have a separate contract, but that's the language that's in the subsection. I don't know. I don't think it's essential. Again, I think anybody who's going to take this on will know what's in the statewide database and what's not in the statewide database. If that's what this paragraph or the subsection does, if there's more to it, and I'm open to another opinion on what it says.
Actually,
It's a binding contract, is it not? A binding contract, what's in here?
All of the requirements in Section 6 are mandatory. We're requesting a response to them, so we can see
Okay.
what the response is from each contractor, and they will be scored.
so because Raul is actually reading this back at the office, he sent me a quick note. It said the no vote data was in there because it's not part of the line drawing and it could cause a view of partisanship, and that was what Mr. McCaskill's view was, that you didn't want, unless you had to go into that data or have a separate contractor do it, you didn't want to have the view that it was influencing a partisan line.
That would be an abuse of the data, and
Okay.
rather than an insight into the differences that might exist within a larger community, which I think we're kind of obligated to find out.
Yeah, and I would disagree with Mr. McCaskill's interpretation of what data is necessary at that level. I think we were going again. I think whether there is enough data will be a question, but I think we will need to look at whatever data are available on this particular issue to decide whether are we in compliance or are we trying to prevent a Section 2 lawsuit when we're drawing a certain district. So we'll need that data. Again, it's not what is formally in the statewide database, and I think that's
I thought that they do have the ability to do it there because they've actually geocoded the voting precincts relative to enumeration districts, things of that nature.
Yeah. And again, race data, of course, is coded in the PL 94 data. We'll know all of that.
Yeah, well, perhaps we could test that with our VRA attorney, who certainly would be aware of Section 2, Section 5 counties, but also the Department of Justice has sued and sometimes resolved voting irregularities in communities throughout California. So that information also would be available for us. I agree that the more data that we have, especially regarding Section 2 and Section 5, the better off we're going to be, and it'll provide an extra measure of protection against a potential lawsuit where we would be challenged for perhaps not considering all the factors that relate to redistricting. So.
Can I suggest then that maybe we assume that maybe we should eliminate, to some degree, that paragraph, I'm assuming.
Well, I don't mind the rest of the paragraph. It's just that one line that
But-
takes voting data out.
Yeah, and I get, part of that, it would be I would hate to tie the hands of a contractor if we put this in the RFP, IFB, then that's what it'll be. If we decide as a commission later on that we would not like to have that data, or if we find that those issues that Mr. McCaskill, well, then we would just direct, would we direct?
It would be an extra cost, too, if we wanted to do it. So it would not be an initial bid to add it in, right?
We will not be able, well, amendments to the resulting contract, I believe we can extend for a year. We can extend the contract for a year without approval. After that, we'd have to do a non-competitive, an amendment to change the terms of that contract.
I guess the question is this something that we should bring to the full commission and make sure that we got the support of our colleagues? Or
I want to make sure
is
we're
something we can do ourselves?
You were still talking about this?
Yeah, I'm talking about this last sentence.
Yeah.
Just the sentence, the last sentence.
Okay.
But how do you all feel about that? Gambino, you said you would support removing it?
Yes, I was going to ask, what you prefer. You may be the most experienced individual here related to this. So, would you prefer to leave it as is, or to strike it, or change it?
I would strike, and the other thing I would bring up is that, we could take racial data and misuse it politically, and nobody's telling us to take that one out. So it's your intent that really counts here, and our intent is not to be partisan. And if we could use this information to help us address area issues and and descriptions of areas that the voting data would imply, not their party preference or candidate preference, but the indications around that, I think we're missing something. So that's what I would support.
And I should clarify, when I say taking, I just meant taking the sentence out, not taking out the technology associated. I think it would just not tie our hands, and if we needed to put those restrictions on at a later date, but again, I think it goes back to Commissioner Baraba saying that we have the ability to use or misuse, but that's what we're here as a commission, and hopefully we will be able to make that determination. So why tie our hands now? We can do that later on.
I agree. I'm inclined to strike that sentence because I believe our approach should be as inclusive as possible, and there will be certain nuances when we get the data, the statewide database, and if there's any information that can assist us in micro-dissecting what these zones are, I think it's at our discretion to use it to our benefit, but we have to have the data in order to make it useful. So I'd rather be inclusive rather than exclusive.
And so how do you?
Yeah, I'd concur with that as well. I mean, I think for process purposes, I'm not sure if we have to recommend this to the full commission or.
Okay, well then let's just take that one sentence out.
Yeah.
I think we could report what we've done and
Yeah.
our reasonings for that.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's what our job is, to kind of not put these details in their plate.
That's fine with me.
Mr. Baraba?
Yes.
I have a question about the peer review. Now, as I understand it, the maps are going to be reviewed by, Secretary of State, and will have to pass muster with the courts. So a peer review then, not necessarily a legal peer review, but a process review, or?
And I was going on what in my conversation with the Arizona executive director. It was a peer review that looked at the data that had been used to actually draw the map that was in question, all of the data, the different comments, and so forth, and then to add a concurrence or dissent, not necessarily to hand you another map, but just to say this is a second opinion, and you may want to consider that my read of this is more that that this should have been done rather than that was done, before you get it for to consider.
So it's like a scientific study. You would just concur with the conclusions of the report or offer some criticisms. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think it's before the end of it, though. It's the ongoing. It would be as we're drawing maps, as we're going into communities. If the line drawer says, I've taken the interpretation of what they said in L.A., and this is what I've come up with, and we as a commission have to make that decision, there'd be the peer review at that time. So as we go through each community and as we do the actual line drawer, there will be the line drawer will give us the lines, but there will be a peer review for us to look to see if there's another option or if there's reasonings behind that. So it will be checks and balance through the process. So
Yeah, so it's throughout the process, not necessarily at the end when the summary report and the maps are done.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, and the one other thing I would say to that, or to add on to that, is that they would be adding this check and balance process for you, and then at the very end, you would have it so that it would just give everyone that vision that you had a second opinion for this particular critical aspect of this venture.
The only concern I have about that process is that it implies that the line drawer can do whatever they want, and then we have somebody looking at it and saying that you did it right or wrong. And I believe that it's our job to be very explicit to what we want the line drawer to accomplish. And then when we get the initial, and while they're doing it, to be involved in observing it. And if we see that the line drawer is not achieving what we asked them to do, which is driven by the proposition that was supported by the people, we change it. We tell the line drawer to change it because it's not the line drawer's final decision. And I just wonder what the value of having a peer review in there, other than because that it presumes that the line drawer is left alone to finish the deal.
It also makes a case that now whatever decision, it's not a clear decision, but there are multiple decisions. I just think it kind of muddies the whole thing also. And why I say that is from my experience with doing evaluations. When we do the evaluation, each of us does not have an opinion. We have one opinion, and it's a consensus, and that's all we put.
Yeah.
And the reason we do that is because then a contractor will come in and challenge us. Well, that party said this many points, so how come this many points, is what the final score was? So it just creates more problem for us if we don't come out with just one.
I guess this was an issue I struggled with a little bit, and I see the advantages both ways. I'm inclined to think that, of course, we as a commissioner will make the final line drawing, but I think there's two aspects. One is the appearance for the public that I think regardless of who we get as a consultant, one group will think they're too much of this, another group will think they're too much of that. And if we can maybe balance, if we have the option to balance it, I think we initially need to get the technical consultant, but there is the option for a peer reviewer if we feel necessary. And number two, I think that as commissioners, we've been instructed not to do our own line drawing. It's very important that as we go through this, we don't do our own line drawing. Therefore, the technical consultant will have access to all the data that's been rolled up. They will have the access to the VRA requirements, and they'll be presenting to us the lines. And I thought that it may be a benefit to have someone else have access to that information and also provide us some feedback. That was the benefit I saw to it.
May I interrupt? Understand that we'll have to go out for a competitive bid to obtain this peer review, and it may or may not be an alternate opinion, but it may be the same opinion as.
And would that not, if it was the same opinion, it may be just reinforce it. But is it not a part of?
But we don't have to award.
It's in this bid. Is it a separate one, or could we?
No. All this states is we've got a requirement to that this contractor work with somebody. We would do a separate bid and a separate contract to hire a consultant to do the peer work.
I thought there might be an option based on those who applied that if we saw one as the contractor, there may be a group or organization or individual from that same pool that we could choose as the subcontractor.
Well,
excuse me.
and this is just a thought, and typically with a state contract that's very technical, where the people who are receiving the information may not have that same technical expertise, you'll have a peer review function to make sure that you get that second opinion. Now, the reason we're staggering, or my thought was to stagger this peer review function, was so that some of those very people who may not be selected to be the line drawer could then put their name in the hat to at least participate in the peer review function. It will be your choice, as you score these individuals for the person that you believe has the best expertise for providing you that separate opinion. But I do believe there's extreme value in making sure that we have, the ability for you to, or for the commission as a whole, to know that someone else has looked at this data and is in concurrence. I think in most cases there will be a concurrence. But if there is, the value of this isn't in the concurrence, it's in the dissent.
Angela?
Well, yeah. I lean more toward Commissioner Baraba's approach, which is that I think regardless of how we do this, I think ultimately we as a commission have to be responsible for the lines. And we're not manipulating them on the computer ourselves, but I think we have to take ultimate responsibility both for the draft and the final version of the lines. Now, having said that, I think it's good to have, because on the commission itself, we don't have the level of technical expertise that we need to sort of, understand how the manipulation of the data via the program itself. So I do feel there's some need to have some technical capacity. But I feel uncomfortable simply because and I'm just sort of thinking worst case scenarios, which is that we get, both a primary consultant and then a peer reviewer who just disagree wildly on things, and then we're kind of stuck trying to figure out how do we decide between the two of them. But again, I think ultimately we have to figure that out anyway. So I'm not overly concerned if we don't have a peer reviewer, but I think it adds to the capacity of the commission overall. One question I might have is how much do you think it would cost to have a peer review contract going? We've gotten some ranges on the primary technical consultant, assuming they're not actually, the peer reviewer isn't actually doing any drawing, they're sort of looking at the maps, deciding whether there are really problems. That may not be that expensive. I'm just kind of curious if there's any sense of what that would cost.
I didn't get a sense from, again, I'm talking to the executive director from Arizona, and so we have a case where people can't even remember that the peer reviewer was there in some cases. So I didn't know or have a sense from him of what it would cost. What I just tentatively placed in the budget was a cost of about 10% of what it would cost to have the lines drawn, thinking that they're not providing equipment, they're not providing any of the rest of it. They're mainly just providing that view. Again, I would like to comment on one of the things you said. If we had a situation where we had a line drawer and a peer review and they were wildly different in their opinion, I think that would be a very important thing to know.
But if they were widely disparate, we would see it. I mean, I'm having a hard time understanding the value of a peer review. There's competencies in this commission to see if somebody achieved what we asked them to achieve.
I think the devil's in the details in terms of, it's my understanding that the actual process will be, and as it's worded in RFP, is the technical consultant is going to be responsible for getting all this data in terms of the public input, in addition to the census, and rolling that up, and then coming to us as a commission and saying, this is where we recommend you put this line. Now, of course, we have the competency to say, yes, we do, or we don't, but we don't have access to all the methodology and all that data. It's just not in our, that's not what we're tasked with doing. So it would appear to me that if you had a peer reviewer to just checks and balance, again, there are individuals on the commission who don't feel as comfortable with technology and may appreciate having two opinions. If they support each other, I think it gives us more confidence that maybe we're on the right track. If there's differences, I think, again, the devil's in the details. It would be very helpful to know where they disagree, and then we as a commission obviously ultimately make that decision. But the checks and balances, we've discussed this with the VRA legal counsel in terms of the benefits of having two perspectives, but that's just my opinion.
Michelle, to my mind, I don't expect the line drawer to take what's been said at the outreach and then make the decision of what to do with it. I expect us to hear what takes on, and based on what we heard, to give direction to the line drawer and say, this is what we want to accomplish based on what we heard from the outreach activity.
Maybe I guess I was under the assumption that all this data would be rolled up. But that was part of, I think, was their requirements, is that they are responsible for rolling up all this data and then presenting to us initial lines, because we can't. Again, they do the lines and then we agree or we disagree or we decide to move that based on it. I don't think we presented that we would interpret the data and then give them direction where to put the lines.
No, I would say direction to what we want to accomplish with the drawing of the lines. And I think that's our responsibility to make that determination. Commissioner Ontiser, maybe he could enlighten us on what he expects to come out of the outreach.
Well, certainly the outreach effort is going to reach out to multiple avenues and community groups to get their input in terms of what they feel communities of interest are, where their neighborhood boundary lines are. All of that that's the baseline. That comes in for our mappers to look at and try to make some sense and codify that and then present that to us. That's the key of the process. But, I don't see anything wrong with having a peer reviewer take a look at that, and that's just an additional information for the commission to look at. And ultimately, in our wisdom, we have to make that final decision, one way or another. So it's just an additional reinforcement, another piece of information for us to analyze and make a critical decision, because ultimately it is our decision.
Commissioner Ontai, when we wrap up or accumulate the comments out of the outreach program, was it your impression then that the line drawer would actually create a set of lines that comprehends that, or do we intervene in between what we heard and what is drawn?
I would assume that during that process, when the PL94 data comes out, and we're having public testimony, and we're discussing that the next 2 months of what that means, we're getting public input coming in. My thought has always been that we're getting feedback from the mappers saying, this is what it's beginning to look like. We may have 3 or 4 or 5, maybe a dozen, even more suggestions that are in the process of taking shape. And we haven't made a decision, but from that process, I think issues are being emerged. Concepts that we need to consider begins to emerge. VRA issues begin to come out. So it's going to be a learning process in that 2 months of public testimony with the mapper providing us visions of how that thing looks like. But we haven't made a decision yet. And if we have a peer consultant on the side saying, yes, I agree, but have you looked at that? That's just additional information for us to look at.
Commissioner Anchetta, did you want to say something?
Yeah, and I think again, I would underscore Commissioner Barraba's general approach, which is that, and I think we should bring this up with the full commission in terms of, because there may be different philosophies regarding how much we're deferring, at least particularly in the draft stage, or delegating to the consultant, because I think there are going to be a lot of very challenging issues, particularly when we have various definitions of neighborhoods and communities of interest, and somebody ultimately has to decide, well, let's figure out and reconcile all these things and draw the lines in a certain way. I think that somebody's the commission, not the consultant. And I think the consultant has the obligation to tell us, well, here's what we got at the last meeting, and here's what these neighborhoods seem to look like. And again, some of them are fully consistent. Maybe something you want to take into account. But whether it's right after the meeting or at the end when we've sort of compiled as much as we can for the first draft, we just have to say, look, okay, we got this sense from you, Mr. or Ms. Consultant. Then we say, do it this way. And I think we have that prerogative. My feeling is we have that prerogative. It's not the consultants. But again, I think there may be different philosophies regarding how much we're having the consultant do it for us first, and then we review versus ours giving direction to the consultant. I lean more toward more engagement by the commission in terms of where those lines are first drawn.
Gambino, do you have a comment?
I see that consultant is advisory, and as was mentioned by Commissioner Antai, the value of having an additional advisor to weigh in on a particular issue that's put before us. Ultimately, as a commission, we have that decision-making power, but it just might be that we have our mapper. We direct our mapper to really kind of draft out, based on new population information, where districts may fall. And then it would be up to us to say, well, we don't like that salamander over here and that salamander over there, so how about, is there a way of, kind of expanding this district so that you bring in those tails or legs or whatever? And but ultimately, we want to. We're driving that ship, So if to have an additional voice, consulting us, advising us, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. We know that in the final analysis, it is going to be our signature on those plans and those maps, and so.
I have a question. Not a question. My comment to the effect is, I guess if it's costly, and if it's overly time-consuming, I probably not want to have official peer review, keeping in mind that we're going to be bombarded with information from public interest groups at our outreach hearings. We're going to have an overwhelming volume of information about. They will essentially serve as some degree of public sector peer review, the citizens of the state. However, I do see the value of having an official peer group, advisory group, providing information on a technical and highly professional level from a neutral, nonpartisan perspective to give us material, a second opinion to take into consideration, as Commissioner Ontai has stated. So I'm sort of neutral in this. It can go either way.
I have a question myself, what this coordination is going to look like. So we're going to have two contractors, and they're going to be looking at the same data and then presenting information to you. I don't know what kind of constraints the contractor will have and what kind of procedures they're going to want that peer review contractor to do, and what kind of deadlines and considerations just to get them to agree on how they're going to work together. We don't have any guidelines for how that's going to happen.
Well, I think there's something here. I think this goes back to all of our concerns. I think we're talking about fruit, but maybe apples and oranges a little bit in terms of there may be a philosophical approach. Maybe Commissioner Baraba's looking at, I guess I see this as there's going to be a massive amount of information that will be coming to the technical consultant in form of census, in terms of all the community outreach, whether it be the meetings, whether it be online submissions. We have numerous organizations that are helping the community. There'll be things that are submitted that we will never even see as a commission because we won't be at a meeting, a public hearing. As many meetings as we try to go to individually, we probably won't be able to go to every single outreach meeting that we hold. Therefore, all this data is not for us to interpret and for us to look at. We have access to it, as my understanding, and we can clarify it, but it's up to the technical consultant to filter that, to consolidate it, to aggregate it, and then to come up with lines for us. And they're going to be doing that based on the direction that we give them in terms of what, in the community in the north, we may have some certain issues or directions that we want to give. It may be different in LA. It may be different on the Central Coast. We're going to give those technical consultants the parameters. We will be the ones that tell them, when you look at this data, this is what we've heard so far, this is what we understand. But ultimately, it would be the technical consultant who will take all this material and present it to us in a line format for which we can make a decision. And if we wanted to have access to the methodology, some of us that are more technically able or have VRA experience will be able to say, well, I agree with this, I don't. And then I would see a peer reviewer also presenting, similar to maybe a legal, I'm not a legal person here, but when you present different opinions to the court, you may have looked at the same information and then you present your opinion. I don't even know if they necessarily would need to work together to present a unified voice in terms of, you're asking your question, how would they work together? I see it more as they have, the technical consultant would do all the work and gather the data and present it in a line, and then that consultant would review that line and either agree or disagree. Because of their expertise, they would know whether or not that's a legitimate line. I don't necessarily think they need to work together in terms of coming to an agreement, but they would need to be able to have access to the same material. But I just can't imagine in the process that we as commissioners will be looking at all the data that we get from the outreach and everything that's submitted to us and the census data and be able to say, okay, now we've looked at all this, we want to give direction to the line drawer. I say it as a two-way process. We give an overview to the line drawer, and then we will review that based on what they give us. And maybe I'm wrong on that, but that was my understanding of how this line drawing would go.
Well, I don't disagree with that approach, but it's the level of detail in which we get involved. I feel that we would be derelict if we didn't see that summary and agree to it and saying this is what was heard, and I want to understand the details of what was heard, and then say based on what was heard, these are the directions, given the law that we're working under, that we want to have accomplished.
So that would be that's kind of along that. So you're saying that they would provide the technical, because this is important, I think, in terms of what we're asking the technical consultant. So in your mind, you see this as the technical consultant would get all that information, and before they would present a line to us, they would meet with a summary and say, this is what we found, and then so it's just a matter of where we're inserting, and I think that's the issue. And then they would go back upon our direction.
And I can tell you, the software that is out there now, is really improved over what was been there in the past. Because if we saw a line and somehow, for whatever reason, the technical consultant took a piece of a county and moved it to another county, and we say, one of our directions was not to split up counties if you could help it. What would happen if that piece of line went back over there? What would be the kind? You could see that instantaneously, and we could, as a group, say, now I understand why you did that, and because it would be worse to try to keep it in the county, and we would then be in a position to when somebody challenged us because we split up a county, to explain why that county was split up. And I think we've got to be involved in that because we're going to be asked those questions when we're done. And we've got to, I'm sure all of you want to be confident that we gave it, if there's something that's out of line with what we were expected to accomplish, we needed to be able to explain that. Oh, yeah. And I'm not sure I need a peer review person telling me how to do that. And I think there's other people on this commission who are also capable of asking those questions.
I think it's a peer review based on the interpretation, the summary that would be provided from the data, because some people might argue you could summarize the data from the community or in different ways. Is that not the case?
Well, you could, but then we've done a very bad job of picking the technical consultant. Maybe a way I would be comfortable is if we left it in as an option, that we could, if we saw fit, to retain the services of a process of peer review.
Because it would be so that would be a recommendation to the commission.
Well, it's currently in that contract. It's currently in there as an option that we retain the right to do that. The only thing I would say to you is that this would have to, and Carol can tell me, this would have to be either a competitive bid, non-competitive bid. It's going to have to go on the routes we talked about, and that takes time. So if it's your idea to wait until you need it, then you have to tack on that amount of time necessary to put that function into place. It's just something that needs to be considered, and we had planned on staggering it behind this contract so that individuals who might have bid on the actual line drawing would have the capability of then reverting to this secondary role. The only thing that the main driving force behind going to this consideration was just the level of scrutiny that our line drawer is going to have. We've already seen that in Claremont. We've already seen how quickly the scrutiny goes to a person that I believe we all think has been fairly impartial in our eyes, and then all of a sudden we have that level of scrutiny, and so we say to ourselves, what can we do to make sure that we create almost a shield for our line drawer, a way for our line drawer to say, yeah, I'm fair, and this person can concur, or we can have these little disagreements. That was where it came from.
And my understanding that if we go through the RFP process, I thought I heard Mrs. Umfleet say this, if we issue the RFP, we don't necessarily have to grant the award. So in August or July, if we want to bring that person on board, they're ready to step up immediately to become that peer review group, correct? So we can issue our option to actually execute the award to its fullest extent or not to, depending on what our need is.
Why wouldn't we go ahead and leave it in as it's written as an option, and then after the outreach committee has a chance to further clarify what we're going to get from that activity, we could make a judgment, a better sounding, assumption, decision as to whether we think we need additional peer review based on the kind of input we're going to be getting from the outreach committee.
I would suggest that it also goes to, I would suggest this is actually an important issue that we bring to the full commission for discussion.
Well, yeah, that would be my intention.
Yeah, okay.
Can I ask a question to Dan? So let's say the outreach committee goes through a process and we come to a point where we realize that we need some outside opinion. Then we notify you and you need to go through the process of hiring a consultant. How long would it take you?
Depends on the dollar amount. There are variables. For instance, if we want to issue a contract that's only up to $10,000, there's a very short process, an abbreviated process that is available. Anything up to $50,000, we can issue without going to DGS Legal. Anything over that, it's a full-blown bid process.
This is a 100-yard sprint. You have to give me some weeks, days. So it's a short form. How many days is that? Is that a week, 2 weeks?
That's probably a month.
A month?
I don't. I just literally reviewed the information, but I'm not drawing, I'm drawing a blank when it said what time frames. I'm not sure I saw that or I didn't pay attention to it. But it's absolutely very fast, in contrast to a full bid.
But 30 days is too long for the outreach committee to get that type of response.
Well,
Let me ask the
Exactly
question this way. If we went and said we want to hire 3 people at $10,000 apiece, we could just do that, right?
you can only just hire somebody up to 5,000.
Okay. So we
And
want
then
to
you can
hire
use a
somebody
short
for-
form for up to 10,000.
Yeah.
Over that, you're in a competitive bid. Now, I ask you to just go back and take a look at this process we're doing right now. We're doing $1 million full-blown bid, and we're trying to award it in a month. We may not be able to because of the obstacles that I outlined, but, you know, this is going to be a much smaller contract, but still, I just think you're looking at, I think the fastest you're going to do a full bid is a month.
See, that would be impossible.
I see. My feeling is that if we say, you know, there's people out there who would be more than happy to be paid $5,000 to make a comment on what we have available, and we could get it. And there would even be organizations out there that would be happy to do that as well, for us to get an assessment of what we found out.
That's just a service order.
Yeah,
That's
No
a service.
you get it just like that.
That's
Are you talking about what we've done at the final maps, or?
No,
because
no. This is the interim for the
interim, yeah.
Interim phase.
Yeah.
Something comes up. We need some outside opinion, some second opinion for the commissioners to look at. And we're perplexed. If that event happens and we feel that we need another opinion, and I don't know what it is, then we're stuck with this time frame.
But I'm sorry, Commissioner Ontai, when you say when something comes up and we're stuck, in what aspects are you stuck in terms of the outreach?
Let's say during the outreach process, we're getting community groups that are saying, well, this is our neighborhood, this is our community. And then it evolves into a voter rights issue. And our mapper and our VC, a voter rights consultant, can't really answer for us. And I don't know what it is. And then we don't know it as well. Now, Vince might know it because he's the expert. But some of us may not be as knowledgeable and may want to raise some questions because we're 14 individuals. So when that happens, we need somebody to quickly come on board and give us an opinion. Could that happen? And if that does happen, how do we handle the contractual arrangement and have someone available?
I like Commissioner Baraba's idea of this $5,000 notion. Perhaps we may want to consider having a qualified candidates pool for these potentially contentious areas so that we can have a qualified Republican, qualified Democrat, and qualified independent that may want to work concertedly to come up with an opinion that they can present to us. And for these areas that might be extremely contentious, sort of like strike teams, or for lack of better words, but people that we can hire for $5,000, $15,000, and we can issue those grants or those awards. How many days, Mrs. Umfleet?
There isn't a day constraint. You could also create that contract so that it's an hourly rate, so you may be able to call back that same party.
That's a quick fix approach. We need qualified individuals statewide, ready and on board, that we can call up quickly for these potential issues. If they do arise, they may not arise, but if they do, we'll have that pool of individuals to consider.
Dan?
Now, one of the things you have to think about is in the establishment of that pool. And once again, we've got a situation where we're talking about establishing a pool that isn't publicly vetted and isn't moved through the competitive bid process. If we started after this, we could do the same thing you're talking about. We could vet a pool, we could make a decision, and I believe we could structure that contract as an hourly contract as well, and say, as we need you, you need to come aboard, and then we'll pay you for these decisions. I think the value of this peer review is in extending our transparency, and if we're going to do that, there's value in ensuring that person or persons come from a pool that's been given a public examination.
So I would suggest that in this bid, where we mentioned it, that we make that as open as possible so that we have all these alternatives in front of us as to how we could go about identifying that peer group. But just alerting the person who bids on this one that there may be the need for us to bring in a peer group. And then we have the option of doing it or not doing it, depending on how things are going.
I'd also like to suggest that we move to bring to the full commission the idea that a peer reviewer, whether it be as an individual format or in a pool, but that we would recommend, if that was the wish of the commission, that we move forward on that. We direct staff to do that because we need to have that person in play or individual in place, the process in place.
And let me just add a point that Dan just made, and I think it's very, very important. By having an outside opinion, this may also be an issue of transparency with the communities that we're dealing with. And it's important for us to know, but it's also a message to the communities themselves. They have to see these perspectives, and I think it'll only help us.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's even organizations out there who would be happy to come and tell us what they saw.
Many will be here on Saturday, actually.
And my only concern, one thing that I'd like to just put out there for this subcommittee or technical advisory committee, is that I like the idea of having a peer reviewer, whether it's an individual or maybe it's an organization that has multiple people. But I'm a little concerned that if we have a pool of peer reviewers, because then I think you get into just additional public comments from, I would imagine, different interest groups. I think if we get the technical consultant on board, part of the aspect of hiring any type of peer reviewer would be their ability to work in collaboration with this individual. It might be, if we're looking for a balance, we would know who the technical consultant is and we would know what the balance would be that we would need. And I think whoever we're hiring are going to be professionals, and they understand this is not a time for bickering, but they, you know, there has to be some impartiality between them as well too. So I think it would negate the need for a pool of peer reviewers, because I would just be concerned that if we had a pool, it would be a lot of people and a lot of additional opinions.
The intent here would be to direct staff to come up with a process that allows us to move expeditiously.
That be the point.
When we feel there's a need to have somebody else come in and give us an opinion.
And that's exactly why we placed it into this contract, and that we were already moving forward on putting together, as a next step, an RFP or an IFP for this function. What I've heard from this commission and from this advisory committee is that we would like to not necessarily bring somebody on board as a full-time consultant, as much as somebody that could give us an hourly rate for those areas that we might direct them to, if there was a necessity. So that's a possibility, or to have them do an entire review. But I think that the key to this is to start now, to put this in place, and then know who that person was after we went through a public review.
It's been suggested we might want to take a break. So if the clock is at, what, 10:30? So let's get back here by a quarter to. What time would we end today?
Yeah, ready to go. We have 11:30 is when we end.
Yeah,
so that
okay.
goes right
So
back.
let's come back at a quarter to. Is that right? Yeah.